How's it going? Adam Drake here again with a short video. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about thread lock. There's definitely key places in nitro where you want to make sure you clean the screw or clean the nut and apply thread lock, but there's also places where you may want to avoid using thread lock. So we're going to start with a couple places where you should avoid using thread lock, and then we'll also talk about where you should use thread lock. So on the screw that secures the clutch bell to the crankshaft, I always make sure to not use thread lock. It doesn't happen often, but from time to time you can break the head off that screw, and then if you use thread lock, it's going to make it really difficult to extract that screw or get the part of the screw that is broken off out of the crankshaft. Now, if that does happen, sometimes you can get lucky, especially if you don't use thread lock. You can use an X-Acto knife, or you can use like a small pick and you can get the screw to back out. But I recommend don't spend too much time on it, because if you mess up the end of the crankshaft's really expensive. You don't want to have to replace your crankshaft. But if you just take the engine, if you have in your local area a machine shop, they can fixture the engine, center drill it, and extract that screw pretty easy. But for me, I always make sure to not use thread lock when securing that screw. I actually use a clutch retaining screw that OS makes. It's a cap head screw that has a built-in shoulder, so it's basically like having a built-in washer on the screw. Part number is 718-14480, or you can just use a normal 3mm screw with a washer. Another place where I avoid using thread lock would be on the clutch pins. So if you're using the stock Mugen MBX8R clutch or the ProTech clutch, any of them where they have removable pins, you would want to make sure not to use thread lock on those pins. Those pins also don't need to be really cranked down. They just need to be kind of snug. You will, however, want to use thread lock to secure the clutch nut to the crankshaft. So when you put the clutch on, you'll first slide the collet on, then you'll put the flywheel on, put a drop of thread lock. I use a mix of blue and red thread lock, so it ends up being purple. You'll put a drop on the threads of the crankshaft, make sure that the clutch nut is clean so that the thread lock will stick to it or bond, and then go ahead and tighten down the clutch nut. And I make sure to make the clutch nut super tight. It's something that I don't really remove often unless there's some serious maintenance you have to do to the engine. So I will always use thread lock on the clutch nut. I will also use thread lock on the screws that go through the bottom of the chassis into the engine mount, because when I set the gear mesh for the engine and center diff, I always make sure to set it a little bit on the tight side, and then I use the little bit of adjustment from the top side, because you can actually, if you loosen the screws that go through the engine into the mount from the top, you can always twist the engine just a little bit. So from the bottom, I use thread lock, make sure those are really tight. On the top side, I don't use thread lock, but I do use small lock washers, which Mugen makes, ProTech, pretty much any of the companies that make hardware. So from the top, no thread lock. From the bottom, I do use thread lock. And then on the rest of the car, pretty much anywhere a screw is going into metal, I like to use thread lock. It's really key on the steering rack bushings to make sure you thread lock them. Also the steering and camber link ends, I'll apply a drop of thread lock into the ball or into the steering bushing, basically to make sure it gets down into the threads. And then I will also put a drop of thread lock on the screw. Again, it's nitro racing. You want to make sure that nothing falls apart. I would rather it be difficult to take stuff apart when I'm ready to do maintenance than have something come loose during the race. But again, a couple key areas where you want to avoid using thread lock would be screw at the end of the crankshaft and also the clutch pins for your nitro engine.